The glass shattered against the marble floor before Eleanor Whitfield could stop her hand from shaking. Every head in the ballroom turned toward the sound, and for one long breath, the music itself seemed to falter. "Careful, Eleanor," her mother hissed under her breath, though her painted smile never wavered for the watching crowd. "Must you always draw attention to yourself in the clumsiest way possible?" Eleanor knelt to gather the broken pieces, her cheeks burning as whispers rippled outward like water disturbed by a stone. She could feel the eyes on her, could hear the soft, cutting laughter behind gloved hands. It was always like this. Her sisters, Charlotte and Margaret, stood a few steps away in gowns of ivory silk, their golden curls catching the candlelight, their faces perfect masks of practiced grace. Beside them, Eleanor felt like a shadow that had wandered into a portrait where it did not belong. "Poor thing," someone murmured nearby, not troubling to lower her voice enough. "It is a wonder the Whitfield sisters share the same blood. One would think Plainest ran only through one branch of the family tree." Eleanor's fingers tightened around a shard of glass until it bit into her palm. She did not cry out. She had long ago learned not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. She rose, set the broken pieces on a passing servant's tray, and pressed her injured hand into the folds of her skirt where no one would notice the thin line of blood. This ball had been arranged for one purpose only: to present Charlotte and Margaret to the finest families of the season, to secure them husbands of wealth and title before the year was through. Eleanor had been brought along not as a prospect herself, but as a companion, an afterthought, a plain frame meant to make the paintings beside her shine brighter by comparison. She had accepted this role many seasons ago. Acceptance did not mean it no longer hurt. She retreated toward the edge of the room, near the tall windows where the night pressed dark and cool against the glass. From there she could watch without being watched, or so she believed. The orchestra began a new piece, and the dance floor filled again with silk and laughter and the practiced elegance of young men bowing over young women's gloved hands. "You would think," came a voice close behind her, sharp enough to carry, "that after 3 seasons, someone might have taught the middle Whitfield girl how to hold a glass properly." Eleanor did not turn. She recognized the voice, a cousin of Lord Pemberton's, a woman who collected cruelty the way others collected fans and ribbons. "Perhaps she was never taught anything at all," another voice added, softer, meant to sound like pity though it carried nothing of the kind. "It cannot be easy, standing beside 2 such beauties every single night. I imagine one simply gives up trying after a while." Laughter followed, brief and light, the kind that vanished as quickly as it came, leaving only its sting behind. Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on the dark glass of the window, on her own faint reflection layered over the garden beyond. She told herself she did not care. She told herself this every season, and every season the words grew a little thinner. She did not notice the man near the far pillar until he moved. He had entered the ballroom perhaps 20 minutes earlier, though very few had marked his arrival, for he had come without fanfare, without the usual crowd of admirers that gathered around men of his rank. Julian Ashworth, Duke of Rothmere, was known throughout the ton for 2 things only: his considerable fortune and his even more considerable silence. He attended perhaps 1 event each season, spoke to almost no one, and left before the night grew old. Hostesses invited him out of obligation and rarely expected him to appear. Mothers with unmarried daughters spoke his name in hopeful whispers, though none had managed to hold his attention for more than the length of a single dance, if that. Tonight he stood near the pillar with a glass of wine he had not touched, his dark eyes moving over the crowd with the detached patience of a man watching a play he had already seen too many times. He had planned to leave within the hour. He always did. Then he saw the moment by the window. He watched the young woman standing very still while 2 others spoke just loudly enough to be heard, watched the flicker of pain cross her face before she smoothed it away, watched her press something into the fabric of her skirt with quiet, practiced discretion. He watched her not flinch, not run, not seek comfort from anyone nearby. She simply stood, absorbing the cruelty the way stone absorbs rain, and turned her face back toward the window as though the words had never touched her at all. Something in her stillness caught him in a way the room's brightest performers never had. He set down his glass. Lady Pemberton's cousin was still speaking, her voice pitched for an audience, when the Duke of Rothmere crossed the floor. Conversations near him died away one by one, like candles pinched out in sequence, until half the ballroom had turned to watch him walk. He did not go toward Charlotte, whose laugh could be heard across 3 rooms, nor toward Margaret, who had spent the better part of the evening positioning herself in his line of sight. He walked directly to the window, directly to Eleanor, and stopped before her with a small, formal bow. "Miss Whitfield," he said, his voice quiet but perfectly clear in the sudden hush. "I wonder if you might do me the honor of joining me for dinner tomorrow evening." For a moment, Eleanor believed she had misheard him entirely. She glanced past his shoulder, certain he must be addressing someone standing behind her, certain this must be some elaborate mistake about to be corrected. But his eyes remained fixed on her, patient and unhurried, waiting for her answer as though the rest of the ballroom did not exist. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper, "I believe there has been some confusion. My sisters are just there. If it is Charlotte or Margaret you—" "I am not confused," he said simply. "I asked for you." The words landed in the silence like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples spread outward through the entire room. Eleanor felt every eye upon her now, not with the familiar contempt she had grown used to, but with something closer to disbelief. Lady Pemberton's cousin had gone pale and silent. Charlotte's smile had frozen halfway between confusion and outrage. Even the musicians seemed to have softened their playing, as though straining to hear what would happen next. Eleanor searched his face for some trace of mockery, some hidden joke she had not yet understood, but she found none. His expression was solemn, almost grave, entirely without the practiced charm she had seen in every other man who had ever approached her family. He looked, if anything, faintly uncertain himself, as though he too were surprised by his own actions. "I do not understand," she said quietly, for his ears alone. "Why would you ask me?" "Because you did not laugh," he said, "and you did not run. Most people in this room do one or the other when they think no one important is watching. I find I would rather share a meal with someone who does neither." Eleanor's throat tightened. She thought of a dozen reasons to refuse him, a dozen ways this could still be some cruel trick orchestrated by people who found her an easy target for sport. But looking into his steady, unreadable eyes, she found she could not make herself believe it. "Very well, Your Grace," she said at last. "I accept." A murmur swept through the crowd like wind through dry leaves. The Duke inclined his head, the barest suggestion of something that might have been relief crossing his features. And then he stepped back, bowed once more, and turned to leave the ballroom exactly as quietly as he had entered it. And Eleanor stood alone by the window, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the entire room must hear it. Behind her, she could hear her mother's sharp intake of breath, could hear Charlotte's furious whisper to Margaret, could feel the weight of 200 astonished stares settling upon her like snow. For the first time in longer than she could remember, no one in that ballroom was laughing at her. She did not know yet what tomorrow's dinner would bring, whether it was kindness or curiosity or something she had no name for. She knew only that something had shifted in the room tonight, some quiet earthquake beneath the polished floor, and that nothing about her place in this family, in this society, would ever look quite the same again. Her mother reached her first, gripping her arm with fingers that dug through the thin silk of her sleeve. "What did you say to him?" Lady Whitfield demanded in a whisper sharp enough to cut. "What trick did you play to catch his eye?" "I said nothing, Mother. I did nothing at all." Eleanor kept her voice low, aware of the many ears still straining to catch every word. "He simply approached me." "Dukes do not simply approach anyone," Lady Whitfield said, though her eyes had already begun to calculate, already begun to see possibility where a moment before there had been only disappointment. "Perhaps he mistook you for someone else in the poor light." Eleanor said nothing to that. It was easier, she had learned, to let her mother believe whatever comforted her most. Charlotte appeared a moment later, her golden curls slightly disturbed from the speed of her crossing, her lovely face arranged into an expression of concern that did not quite reach her eyes. "How very strange," she said lightly. "I am sure it was only politeness on his part. The Duke is known to be an odd sort of man. Perhaps he felt sorry for you, standing alone all evening." "Perhaps," Eleanor agreed, though something in her chest refused to accept the explanation so easily. Margaret said nothing at all. She only studied Eleanor with a long, measuring look, the kind she usually reserved for rivals rather than sisters, before turning sharply away to rejoin the dancing. Eleanor excused herself soon after, claiming a headache that was not entirely a lie, and made her way toward the quiet of the garden terrace where the noise of the ballroom faded into the soft rustle of late summer leaves. She pressed her uninjured hand against the cool stone railing, and let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. She thought of his eyes, steady and unhurried, and the strange certainty in his voice when he had said he was not confused, that he had asked for her and no one else. No man of consequence had ever looked at her that way before, as though she were the only person worth seeing in a crowded room. She did not yet know what to make of it. Perhaps it was pity, as Charlotte suggested. Perhaps it was some game whose rules she had not yet learned. Or perhaps she allowed herself to wonder for just a moment beneath the quiet stars. It was something else entirely, something she had never been offered before and did not quite know how to hold. Behind her, the music continued, bright and indifferent, as though the ballroom had already forgotten the strange, brief silence that had gripped it only minutes before. But Eleanor had not forgotten. She suspected she would not forget for a very long time. Outside, the carriage carrying the Duke of Rothmere pulled away into the dark street, and inside it, Julian sat with his hands folded and his mind turning over the strange decision he had just made. He could not explain it fully, even to himself. He knew only that in a room full of practiced smiles, he had finally seen something honest, and he found he was not yet ready to let it go. Tomorrow evening he would sit across from her at his own table, away from watching eyes and whispered judgments, and perhaps then he would understand why one quiet, overlooked young woman had undone the careful indifference he had spent years building around his heart. The knock on Eleanor's door came far too early the next morning, and far too insistently for anything good to follow it. "Get up," Lady Whitfield said, sweeping into the room without waiting for permission. "We have a great deal to discuss before this evening, and very little time in which to do it." Eleanor sat up slowly, rubbing sleep from her eyes, still uncertain whether the events of the previous night had truly happened, or whether she had simply dreamed them into being. But her mother's face, tight with a strange mixture of hope and suspicion, told her the memory was real. "You must not embarrass this family," Lady Whitfield continued, pacing the small room as though it were a stage. "Whatever moved the Duke to notice you, we cannot afford to let the opportunity slip away through clumsiness or foolish talk. Do you understand me?" "I understand, Mother." Eleanor kept her voice even, though something inside her twisted uncomfortably at the word opportunity, as though she herself were a business arrangement rather than a daughter. By midday, the house had transformed into a hive of nervous activity. Charlotte and Margaret drifted in and out of Eleanor's room under the pretense of helping her prepare, though their comments carried less kindness than curiosity, and their curiosity carried something sharper still beneath it. "I still cannot understand it," Margaret said, examining Eleanor's plainest gray gown with open disapproval. "You will need something finer than this if you mean to dine with the Duke. He has already seen me in far less," Eleanor said quietly. "If he wished for someone finer, he would have chosen someone else." Charlotte laughed, though there was little warmth in it. "Perhaps he simply wishes to be seen doing something unusual. Dukes grow bored easily, I am told. It amuses them to break from expectation now and then, the way a gentleman might wear an old coat to a garden party just to see who notices." Eleanor said nothing, though the words lodged themselves somewhere beneath her ribs and stayed there, quietly aching, for the rest of the afternoon. When the carriage arrived that evening to collect her, sent by the Duke himself rather than requiring her family to make the journey, Eleanor climbed inside with her heart beating unevenly against her chest. The interior was elegant but not ostentatious, dark leather and polished wood, nothing like the gilded excess she had expected from a man of his fortune. She found, oddly, that she preferred it this way. Rothmere House stood at the edge of the city, tall and formal, its windows glowing gold against the darkening sky. A butler met her at the door, an older man with kind eyes and an economy of words that suggested long service and deep loyalty. "His Grace is expecting you in the small dining room," he said, leading her through a series of quiet, handsome halls. "He asked that I mention he does not often entertain, so you must forgive him if the arrangements are simpler than you are accustomed to." Eleanor found this admission strangely comforting. She had feared an evening of performance, of proving herself worthy amid crystal and silver she did not know how to navigate. Instead, she found a modest table set for two, a fire burning low in the hearth, and Julian Ashworth rising to his feet the moment she entered the room. "Miss Whitfield," he said, and there was something in the careful formality of his greeting that suggested he too had spent the day uncertain of how this evening would unfold. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for asking me, Your Grace." She took the seat he offered, arranging her hands carefully in her lap, searching for something to say that would not sound foolish. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled. A clock somewhere in the house marked the passing seconds with quiet precision. "I imagine you have questions," Julian said finally. "Most people would, in your position." "I have several," Eleanor admitted, "though I am not certain which is wisest to ask first." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Ask whichever troubles you most." "Very well." She lifted her chin slightly, gathering her courage. "Why did you approach me last night, Your Grace? You could have spoken to any woman in that room. Many would have welcomed your attention far more eagerly than I did." Julian considered the question with the same careful patience he seemed to bring to everything. "I have attended a great many balls in my life," he said at last. "I have watched a great many people perform kindness, wit, and charm for an audience they hope to impress. It grows tiresome, watching the same performance repeated in different gowns. Last night, I watched you endure unkindness without performing anything at all. You did not weep for sympathy. You did not laugh it away to seem unbothered. You simply stood and bore it and remained yourself. I found I wanted to know more of that self." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, uncertain whether it came from embarrassment or something gentler. "You make it sound almost admirable, Your Grace. I assure you, in the moment, it felt only like humiliation." "Perhaps," he said, "but humiliation born with dignity is a rarer thing than people realize. I have seen very little of it in my life." They spoke through the first course in careful, measured exchanges, each testing the boundaries of the other's guardedness. Eleanor learned that Julian rarely left his estates except for matters of business, that he preferred the quiet company of his library to the noise of society, that he had inherited the dukedom young and had spent the years since learning to carry its weight largely alone. He offered these facts plainly, without self-pity, though Eleanor sensed the loneliness beneath them all the same. "And you, Miss Whitfield," he said, as the second course arrived, "tell me something true about yourself. Not the version your mother has surely instructed you to present tonight." Eleanor laughed before she could stop herself, a genuine, startled sound that seemed to surprise them both. "That is rather direct, Your Grace. I find directness saves a great deal of time," he said, "and I suspect we have both had enough of pretending for one lifetime." She considered his request seriously, turning her fork over in her fingers. "I love gardens more than ballrooms," she said finally. "I would rather spend an afternoon with my hands in soil than an evening in silk. I read more than is considered proper for a young woman of my station, and I have opinions about most of what I read, which my mother finds tiresome and my sisters find baffling. I am plain, Your Grace, and I have made my peace with that truth long ago. I would rather be plain and honest than beautiful and hollow." Julian studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, softened, as though a door long closed had opened only a crack. "I do not find you plain, Miss Whitfield," he said quietly. "I find you remarkably difficult to look away from, though I confess I am still working out why." The words settled over the table like warmth from the fire, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eleanor did not know how to respond to a compliment, because she believed, entirely, that he meant it. The rest of the evening passed more easily than she could have imagined, conversation drifting from books to gardens, to the small, quiet observations two careful people make when they are beginning, cautiously, to trust one another. When at last the carriage returned her home, Eleanor sat in the darkness reliving every word, every silence, every unexpected moment of understanding, and found she was smiling in a way that had nothing to do with duty or performance at all. But not everyone in London spent that evening so peacefully. By the following morning, word of the Duke of Rothmere's private dinner with the Plainest Whitfield sister had traveled through every fashionable drawing room in the city, carried on the same eager tongues that had mocked her only 2 nights before. Some called it charity, some called it madness. A few, more dangerous than the rest, began to whisper that Eleanor must have engineered the entire affair through some scheme too clever for anyone to yet uncover. Lady Vivian Harcourt, a widow of considerable beauty and even more considerable ambition, heard the news over her morning tea and set down her cup with unusual care. She had spent the better part of 2 years positioning herself as the most likely candidate to finally draw the reclusive Duke of Rothmere back into society, and back into marriage. The idea that he had instead chosen a plain, unremarkable girl from a struggling family struck her not merely as surprising, but as an insult requiring correction. "How very curious," she murmured to her companion, her voice light but her eyes cold. "I believe I shall have to pay a call on the Whitfield family very soon." At the Whitfield house that same morning, Eleanor's mother received the news of the previous evening's success with barely contained excitement, already speaking of second dinners, of formal courtship, of the social triumph such a match would represent. Charlotte's smile had grown thin and brittle over breakfast, her congratulations offered in a tone that did not match the words themselves. Margaret said little, though Eleanor caught her watching from across the table with an expression she could not quite name, something between calculation and envy. Eleanor herself said little of the evening beyond the barest facts her family demanded. She did not tell them of the fire's warmth, or the fork turned over in her fingers, or the way Julian's eyes had settled fully upon her as though she were the only interesting thing in the entire city. Some things, she decided, quietly folding the memory away like a pressed flower between the pages of a book, were too new and too fragile to survive her family's careful, calculating attention. That afternoon, Eleanor escaped to the small garden behind the house, the one patch of the property that belonged to her more than to anyone else, since no one else in the family cared to tend it. She knelt in the soil among the late roses, working the earth loose around their roots, and let her thoughts drift back over the dinner without her mother's voice or her sister's glances to interrupt them. She thought of the way Julian had listened when she spoke, not with the polite, distracted patience most men offered before steering the conversation back toward themselves, but with genuine attention, as though her words carried real weight. She thought of the small, rare smile that had touched his mouth when she confessed her love of gardens, as if the admission pleased him more than any practiced charm could have. "You will ruin your gloves," a voice said from the garden gate, and Eleanor looked up to find her father watching her with the quiet, gentle amusement he reserved only for her. "I have ruined worse," she said, sitting back on her heels. "Good afternoon, Father." Lord Whitfield stepped into the garden and lowered himself onto the stone bench nearby, his joints protesting the movement with a faint groan. He was a quiet man, worn thin by years of managing a family whose expenses had long outpaced its income, and he rarely involved himself in his wife's ambitions for their daughters. But something in his expression today suggested he had come with a purpose. "Your mother tells me the dinner went well," he said. "It did," Eleanor admitted. "Better than I expected, if I am honest." "And the Duke himself, what did you make of him?" Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering, turning a fallen rose petal between her fingers. "He is not what people say of him, Father. They call him cold, but I did not find him cold at all. Guarded, perhaps. Careful. As though he has learned that trusting people costs more than it is worth." Her father nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the roses without truly seeing them. "There was a great sorrow in that family some years ago," he said. "His first marriage ended badly, though the details were never made fully public. I have heard only fragments myself, second-hand and unreliable, but I imagine a man does not become as private as the Duke of Rothmere without good reason." "Do you know what happened?" Eleanor asked, her curiosity sharpening despite herself. "Only that his wife did not die a natural death, and that the circumstances surrounding it were quiet enough to suggest the family worked hard to keep them quiet. Beyond that, I know little more than the rest of London, which is to say almost nothing at all." He studied his daughter for a long moment. "I tell you this not to frighten you away from him, Eleanor, but so that you go forward with open eyes, if indeed you intend to go forward at all. A man carrying that kind of grief does not offer his attention lightly. If he has chosen you, he has likely chosen carefully." Eleanor absorbed this in silence, turning the fragment of information over in her mind alongside everything else she had learned the previous evening. It explained, perhaps, the careful distance in his manner, the sense that every word he offered had been weighed before it was spoken. It did not frighten her, as her father seemed to fear it might. If anything, it deepened her curiosity, and something gentler than curiosity as well. Something that felt dangerously close to tenderness for a man she barely knew. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. "I will be careful, Father, I promise you that." "I know you will," he said, rising from the bench with some effort. "You have always been the most careful of my daughters, Eleanor. Whatever your mother and sisters may say to the contrary, careful is not the same as small. I hope you remember that, whatever comes of this strange business with the Duke." He left her alone in the garden then, and Eleanor sat among the roses a while longer, watching the afternoon light shift and soften across the small familiar space that had always been hers alone. Tomorrow, she suspected, would bring new questions, new whispers, perhaps new dangers she could not yet see clearly. But for this one quiet hour, she allowed herself simply to sit with the memory of a fire's warmth and a Duke's steady, searching eyes, and to hope, cautiously, that something real might yet grow from such an unlikely beginning. She did not yet know that beyond her own quiet household, a far more dangerous kind of attention had already begun to gather against her, one that would not be so easily kept at bay. The invitation arrived 3 days later, and this time it came with a name attached that made Eleanor's stomach tighten the moment she read it. Lady Vivian Harcourt requested the pleasure of the Whitfield family's company at a garden luncheon that Saturday afternoon. "How generous of her," Lady Whitfield said, reading the card over Eleanor's shoulder with obvious delight. "Lady Harcourt rarely extends invitations beyond her closest circle. This is a wonderful opportunity for all of you." Eleanor said nothing, though she had heard enough whispers over the past 3 days to understand precisely why such an invitation had suddenly appeared. Word of her second dinner with the Duke, quiet and private though it had been, had somehow found its way into every fashionable drawing room in London. She was no longer simply the plain Whitfield sister. She was now a curiosity, a puzzle other women wished to examine up close. And Lady Harcourt, by all accounts the most determined of the Duke's would-be admirers, wished to examine her most closely of all. The garden luncheon, when Saturday arrived, proved every bit as uncomfortable as Eleanor had feared. Lady Harcourt greeted the Whitfield family with warm, practiced charm, seating Eleanor at her own table as though granting her a great honor, and then spent the following hour dismantling her with a precision so elegant that most of the surrounding guests did not even realize an attack was underway. "Miss Whitfield," Lady Harcourt said, pouring tea with steady, graceful hands, "you must tell us how you find His Grace's company. I confess I have always found him rather difficult to draw into conversation. Perhaps you have discovered some particular trick to it." "I have found no tricks necessary, my lady," Eleanor said carefully. "We simply speak plainly with one another." "How refreshing." Lady Harcourt's smile did not waver. "Though I imagine plain speaking comes rather naturally to you, given your circumstances. Not every young woman has the luxury of clever conversation to fall back upon when other charms are less abundant." A ripple of soft laughter moved around the table, quickly smothered but not quickly enough. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm, though she kept her expression carefully composed, remembering Julian's words from their dinner. Humiliation borne with dignity is a rarer thing than people realize. "I have always believed conversation matters more than appearance in the end, my lady," Eleanor said evenly, "though I understand not everyone shares that view." Something flickered across Lady Harcourt's face, brief and sharp, quickly hidden behind her practiced smile. "How wise of you to think so. It must be a great comfort holding such a belief." The exchange continued in this manner throughout the afternoon, each remark wrapped in silk and edged with something far less gentle beneath. By the time the luncheon ended, Eleanor's head ached from the effort of remaining composed, and she understood, with growing clarity, that Lady Harcourt intended to remain a formidable obstacle in whatever quiet courtship was beginning between herself and the Duke. Her sisters proved little better company on the carriage ride home. "I do think you might have been more gracious," Charlotte said, adjusting her gloves with unnecessary attention. "Lady Harcourt has been nothing but kind to our family, and you spoke to her as though you were her equal." "I only answered her questions honestly," Eleanor said. "That is precisely the trouble." Margaret's voice carried an edge Eleanor had rarely heard from her before. "You have always believed honesty excuses everything, Eleanor, but the world does not reward honesty. It rewards knowing one's place." "And what place is that, precisely?" Eleanor asked, more sharply than she intended. Margaret did not answer, only turned her face toward the carriage window, and the remainder of the ride passed in tense, uncomfortable silence. That evening, alone in her room, Eleanor allowed herself, briefly, to doubt everything. Perhaps her sisters were right. Perhaps she had overstepped some invisible boundary she did not fully understand, some rule governing how a plain, unremarkable young woman ought to behave when granted unexpected attention from a man so far above her in rank and fortune. She thought of Lady Harcourt's cold, elegant cruelty, and wondered how many more such luncheons awaited her before the season's end, how many more rooms she would have to enter knowing every eye in them waited eagerly for her to stumble. She did not see Julian again for nearly a week, though he sent a brief note explaining that pressing business at one of his northern estates required his attention. The note was short but warm, closing with a line that Eleanor read a dozen times before finally setting it aside. "I find myself looking forward to our next conversation more than I have looked forward to anything in a very long while." When he finally called upon her again, he found her in the small garden behind her family's house, kneeling among the roses exactly as her father had found her days before. He watched her for a moment before announcing himself, something in the sight of her working quietly among the flowers, entirely unaware of being observed, settling some restless part of him that had not found peace in a very long time. "You garden even in your finest afternoon dress," he said finally, and Eleanor startled, rising quickly to her feet with dirt still clinging to her gloves. "Your Grace, forgive me. I did not hear the carriage." "There is nothing to forgive." He studied the roses behind her with genuine interest rather than polite pretense. "These are remarkably well tended. Did you plant them yourself?" "Most of them, yes. It is the one part of this house that belongs entirely to me." She hesitated, then added, "I heard you were called away on business." "I was, though I confess the business occupied rather less of my thoughts than I expected it to." He met her eyes directly, and Eleanor felt the familiar warmth rise in her chest at the steadiness of his attention. "I understand you attended a luncheon with Lady Harcourt while I was away." Eleanor's expression must have betrayed something, for his own grew more serious immediately. "What did she say to you?" "Nothing of consequence, Your Grace," Eleanor said, though her voice lacked conviction even to her own ears. Eleanor. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his low, careful voice sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "I would rather you told me plainly. I have known Lady Harcourt a long while. I am aware of what she is capable of when she believes something she wants is threatened." Eleanor sighed, and slowly, reluctantly, recounted the worst of the exchange, watching his jaw tighten with each remark she repeated. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the roses rather than on her. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "I did not consider, when I approached you that evening, how much difficulty my attention might bring upon you. Society is rarely kind to those who rise unexpectedly, and I have made you a target simply by choosing to notice you." "I do not regret being noticed, Your Grace," Eleanor said quietly. "Whatever difficulty has come with it." Something shifted in his expression, softened around the edges of his careful composure. "Julian," he said, "if we are to continue as we have begun, I would prefer you use my name, at least when we are private as we are now." "Julian," she repeated, testing the shape of it, and found she liked the way it felt. They walked together through the small garden as the afternoon light began to lengthen and soften, and Julian, perhaps prompted by her honesty about the luncheon, began to speak of things he rarely shared with anyone. "You asked me once why I approached you that first evening," he said. "I gave you part of the truth. I did not give you all of it." Eleanor said nothing, only waited, sensing the weight behind his words. "I was married once before," he said, "some years ago now. Her name was Isabel." He paused, choosing his words with obvious care. "She was beautiful and charming, and everyone who met her believed our marriage a great success. I believed it myself, for a time. I did not see, until it was far too late, that the woman I had married, and the woman who actually existed beneath that beauty, were two entirely different people." Eleanor listened in careful silence as he continued, his voice growing quieter, more distant, as though he were speaking of events that had happened to someone else entirely. "She was unhappy in our marriage, though she never told me so directly. She sought comfort elsewhere, in ways I did not discover until it had already caused a great deal of harm. When the truth finally came to light, the resulting scandal very nearly destroyed both our families. She died not long after, in circumstances I still do not fully understand myself, and I was left to manage the wreckage of a marriage that had never been what it appeared to be." "I am so sorry, Julian," Eleanor said softly. "I tell you this not for your sympathy," he said, "but so that you understand why I have avoided society these past several years, why I trust so few people, why I noticed you that evening precisely because you did not perform for anyone watching. I have had enough of performance to last a lifetime. I wanted, for once, something real." Eleanor absorbed this confession slowly, feeling the weight of it settle over her like a heavy cloak. She understood now the careful distance in his manner, the guardedness beneath his politeness, the way he weighed every word before speaking it. She understood, too, the risk he had taken in choosing her, a risk that made Lady Harcourt's cruelty seem small and petty by comparison. "Thank you for trusting me with this," she said finally. "I promise you, whatever else happens between us, I will never give you cause to regret it." Julian studied her for a long moment, something unguarded and hopeful moving behind his dark eyes. "I believe you," he said, "which frightens me rather more than I expected it to." They stood together in the fading light, two careful people beginning, cautiously, to trust one another with the truths they had spent years guarding. Neither of them noticed the curtain twitching in an upstairs window of the house, nor the figure watching them from behind the glass with an expression that had nothing gentle in it at all. Before Julian departed that evening, he lingered a moment longer at the garden gate, watching Eleanor gather her gardening tools with the same quiet care she brought to everything she did. "I have thought of something," he said. "There is a small gathering at my sister's house next week, nothing so grand as a ball, only a few families for cards and conversation. I would like you to attend, if you are willing. I think it is time I stopped hiding what has grown between us behind private dinners and garden visits." Eleanor's heart quickened at the suggestion. "Are you certain, Julian? After what happened at Lady Harcourt's luncheon, I confess I have little appetite for further public scrutiny." "I am certain," he said. "My sister is not like Lady Harcourt. She will judge you fairly, and I find I would rather face whatever whispers follow than continue pretending this is nothing more than idle curiosity on my part." He paused, something almost vulnerable crossing his careful expression. "It is not nothing, Eleanor. I think you know that as well as I do." "I know it," she said softly. "I will come." He took her hand then, pressing a brief formal kiss to her gloved knuckles that nonetheless sent warmth traveling up her arm and settling somewhere near her heart. "Until next week then." She watched his carriage pull away down the narrow street and stood a long while in the deepening dusk, turning over everything he had shared with her that afternoon. The story of Isabel troubled her, not because it made her think less of Julian, but because it revealed how deeply he had been wounded, how carefully he had rebuilt the walls around himself in the years since. She understood now that whatever was growing between them carried a weight far beyond ordinary courtship. He was not simply choosing a wife. He was choosing, cautiously and with great difficulty, to trust again after trust had once been so thoroughly betrayed. She thought too of Lady Harcourt's cold smile across the tea table, and wondered how a woman so wounded by his rejection might respond to seeing him step further still into public affection for another. She did not yet understand the full extent of what Lady Harcourt was capable of, but some instinct, quiet and persistent, warned her that the garden luncheon had been only the opening move in a much longer contest. Inside the house, Margaret remained at her window long after Julian's carriage had disappeared from view, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her thoughts circling with a bitterness she had not fully allowed herself to name until now. She had watched Eleanor, plain, quiet, unremarkable Eleanor, receive from the Duke of Rothmere a tenderness and trust that no man had ever offered to her, despite her beauty, despite her charm, despite every effort she had poured into securing precisely such a match for herself. It was not fair, she told herself, pacing the small confines of her room. She had spent 3 seasons perfecting every skill society demanded of a young woman hoping to marry well. She danced beautifully. She conversed cleverly. She dressed with careful attention to every trend the fashionable papers recommended. And yet men who admired her rarely offered anything beyond admiration itself, drifting instead toward wealthier prospects or more advantageous connections, leaving her season after season with promises unfulfilled. Eleanor had done none of this. Eleanor had simply stood by a window saying nothing, doing nothing, and somehow captured the attention of the most eligible, most guarded man in London without any apparent effort at all. The unfairness of it settled into Margaret's chest like a stone, heavy and immovable, and by the time she finally lay down to sleep that night, something cold and calculating had begun to take shape behind her jealousy, though she could not yet have said precisely what form it would eventually take. She did not wish her sister genuine harm, not truly, not in the quiet hours when her better nature still held some sway over her thoughts. But she found herself, increasingly, unable to celebrate Eleanor's fortune, unable to offer the warmth a sister ought to offer, and instead found her mind returning again and again to Lady Harcourt's sharp, elegant cruelty at the luncheon, wondering whether an alliance with such a woman might serve her own interests rather better than continued loyalty to a sister who had, in Margaret's increasingly bitter estimation, stolen an opportunity that rightfully belonged to someone more deserving. The seed had been planted. It would need very little encouragement to grow into something far more dangerous than simple envy. And across the city, in a grand house filled with cold elegance and wounded pride, Lady Vivian Harcourt was already searching for precisely the kind of ally who might help her tend it. She did not yet know Margaret's name, nor the resentment quietly taking root behind the younger Whitfield sisters' carefully composed smile. But women like Lady Harcourt possessed a particular talent for sensing weakness in others, for finding the small cracks of jealousy and disappointment that could be widened, patiently and skillfully, into something capable of bringing down even the most unlikely of romances. It would only be a matter of time before the two women found one another, drawn together by their shared, bitter conviction that Eleanor Whitfield had somehow claimed a prize that belonged, by every reasonable measure, to someone else entirely. Lady Harcourt, for her part, spent the days following the luncheon gathering information the way a general gathers intelligence before a campaign. She learned of the Whitfield family's precarious finances, of Lord Whitfield's mounting debts, of the small, unremarkable dowry that would accompany Eleanor into any marriage. She learned, too, of Margaret's increasingly visible frustration at her own lack of prospects, information gathered secondhand through servants and acquaintances who traded such details as easily as gossip over cards. None of it yet formed a complete plan. But Lady Harcourt was a patient woman, skilled in the slow, careful art of dismantling a rival's happiness one small stone at a time, and she sensed, with the sharp instinct of long practice, that the foundation beneath Eleanor Whitfield's newfound fortune was far less solid than it appeared from the outside. A family burdened by debt, a sister burning with quiet envy, a society eager to believe the worst of an unremarkable girl who had somehow captured an impossible prize. It would take time, she told herself, settling back into her chair with a small, satisfied smile. But she had never yet failed to secure what she truly wanted, and she did not intend to begin failing now. Not when the prize in question was the last, best chance she had of securing her own future among the highest ranks of society. Eleanor Whitfield would learn, soon enough, precisely how quickly good fortune could be undone by those determined enough to undo it. Eleanor, unaware of the quiet storm gathering against her, spent that night in peaceful, hopeful sleep, dreaming of gardens and firelight and a duke's steady, searching eyes, entirely unprepared for what the coming weeks would bring. The gathering at Lady Sophia Vane's house proved nothing like the ordeal Eleanor had feared. Julian's sister greeted her at the door with a warmth so genuine it startled Eleanor into momentary silence, taking both her hands and studying her face with open, unguarded curiosity, rather than the cool assessment Eleanor had grown accustomed to from society's finer drawing rooms. "So you are the one who has finally coaxed my brother out from behind his walls," Sophia said, a smile spreading across features that shared Julian's dark eyes but none of his careful reserve. "I confess I had begun to lose hope of ever seeing it happen." Come in, you must tell me everything." The evening passed in easy conversation over cards and quiet music, a small enough gathering that Eleanor found herself able to breathe freely for the first time since the ordeal at Lady Harcourt's luncheon. Julian remained close throughout, not hovering but present in a way that steadied her, offering a quiet word here, a reassuring glance there, whenever the unfamiliar company grew overwhelming. "You see," he murmured to her at one point, as Sophia laughed brightly across the room at something one of the other guests had said, "not everyone in my life is quite so difficult to please as Lady Harcourt." "I am beginning to see that," Eleanor admitted, allowing herself, for the first time in weeks, to relax fully into the pleasure of simply being welcomed somewhere. Later that evening, after most of the other guests had departed, and only a small circle remained by the fire, Sophia drew Eleanor aside with the easy familiarity of a woman already certain they would become close friends. "My brother has told me very little about you," Sophia said, settling onto the settee beside her, "which, knowing him, tells me a great deal in itself. He does not share his thoughts easily, Miss Whitfield, not since Isabel. I confess I had begun to worry he never would again." Eleanor hesitated, uncertain how much Sophia knew of the story Julian had shared with her in the garden. "He has told me something of what happened," she said carefully. "Not everything, I think, but enough to understand why he has been so guarded." Sophia's expression softened, something sorrowful passing briefly behind her eyes. "It was a difficult time for our family. Julian blamed himself for a great while, though none of it was truly his doing. Isabel was skilled at presenting exactly the face each person wished to see, and by the time the truth revealed itself, the damage could not be undone." She studied Eleanor for a long moment. "I tell you this not to burden you, but because I think you should know how rare it is, what I am seeing tonight. My brother has not looked at anyone the way he looks at you, not in all the years since. I do not say this lightly." Eleanor felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "I care for him a great deal, Lady Vane. Whatever comes of it, I promise you that much is true." "Sophia, please," his sister said, squeezing her hand warmly. "I have a feeling we shall be seeing a great deal of one another." Eleanor returned home that night with her heart fuller than it had been in longer than she could remember. The warmth of Sophia's welcome and Julian's steady presence wrapping around her like a favorite shawl against the evening chill. For the first time since the whole strange affair had begun, she allowed herself to imagine, cautiously, a future she had never permitted herself to hope for before. That hope lasted precisely 4 days. It was Charlotte who brought the news, appearing in Eleanor's doorway one afternoon with an expression that mixed genuine alarm with something Eleanor could not quite identify beneath it. "You must come downstairs," Charlotte said. "Mother has received a letter and she is beside herself." Eleanor found her mother in the drawing room, pale and trembling, a folded paper clutched in her hands as though it might burn her fingers. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, alarm rising quickly in her chest. "Mother, what has happened?" "This," Lady Whitfield said, thrusting the paper toward her with shaking hands. "This arrived an hour ago, unsigned, delivered by a boy who vanished before anyone could question him." Eleanor unfolded the paper with growing dread and read the words written there in a careful, unfamiliar hand. The letter claimed, in cold and deliberate language, that Eleanor Whitfield had deliberately engineered her introduction to the Duke of Rothmere through a scheme involving false pretenses about her family's finances, that she had misrepresented herself and her intentions in order to secure a match far beyond what her circumstances or character truly deserved, and that further details of this deception would soon be made known throughout society, unless certain unspecified demands were met. "This is nonsense," Eleanor said, though her hands had begun to tremble as badly as her mother's. "I have done nothing of the sort. I never sought his attention at all. You know this. You were there the night he first approached me." "I know what I saw," Lady Whitfield said, "but knowledge and belief are not the same thing, and society will believe whatever story proves more entertaining, regardless of truth. If this letter finds its way into the wrong hands, if this accusation becomes public before we understand who is behind it, the damage to this family could be beyond repair." Eleanor read the letter again, searching for some clue as to its author, but found only carefully vague language designed to wound without revealing its source. She thought immediately of Lady Harcourt, of the cold calculation she had sensed beneath the woman's elegant cruelty at the luncheon, but she had no proof, nothing beyond instinct and suspicion. "I must tell Julian," she said finally. "Are you certain that is wise?" Charlotte asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Perhaps it would be better to let the matter quietly resolve itself, rather than risk drawing further attention to it." "I will not hide something like this from him," Eleanor said firmly. "Whatever comes of it, he deserves to know the truth before rumor reaches him twisted beyond recognition." She sent word to Rothmere House that same afternoon, and Julian arrived within the hour, his expression grave as he read the letter Eleanor placed in his hands. He read it twice, his jaw tightening with each pass, before finally setting it down on the table between them. "This is Vivian Harcourt's doing," he said, with a certainty that surprised Eleanor. "I do not have proof, not yet, but I recognize the shape of this kind of cruelty. She has done similar things before, to other women who threatened positions she believed rightfully hers." "What do we do?" Eleanor asked, her voice steadier now that he had arrived, as though his presence alone lent her courage. "We do nothing rash," Julian said. "I will make quiet inquiries of my own, and I will speak with my solicitor about how best to protect your family's reputation, should this letter's contents find their way further into public circulation. But Eleanor, I want you to hear this clearly. Whatever comes of this, I do not believe a word of what that letter claims, and I will not allow it to change my regard for you." "You cannot be certain of that," Eleanor said quietly. "Not yet. This could grow far worse before it grows better." "I am certain," he said, taking her hand with a firmness that left no room for doubt. "I have seen enough of deception in my life to recognize honesty when I find it, and I have found nothing but honesty in you since the night we met. I will not abandon you to face this alone, whatever form it eventually takes." Eleanor felt tears gather unexpectedly in her eyes, grateful beyond words for the steadiness of his conviction even as fear continued to coil tightly in her chest. She did not yet know how far Lady Harcourt was prepared to go, nor how much damage a determined enemy could inflict upon a family with so little standing to defend itself. But sitting there with her hand held firmly in Julian's, she allowed herself to believe, if only for a moment, that they might weather whatever storm was coming together. Neither of them noticed Margaret standing just outside the drawing-room door, close enough to have heard every word of the exchange, her expression unreadable in the dim hallway light. She had not written the letter herself, nor had she any direct hand in its creation. But she had spoken, 3 days earlier, with a woman she had encountered at a small social gathering. A woman with cold, elegant eyes and a voice full of sympathetic understanding for the unfair burdens placed upon younger, less fortunate sisters. Margaret had said more than she should have. Details about her family's finances, about her own quiet resentment. Details she had told herself meant nothing at the time. Standing now in the shadowed hallway, listening to Julian's unwavering defense of the sister she had begun, quietly and reluctantly, to envy rather than love, Margaret felt the first cold stirrings of regret twist through her chest. She retreated to her room before either of them could discover her there, closing the door softly behind her and sinking onto the edge of her bed with her hands pressed against her face. She thought back to the conversation that had led her to this moment, a conversation she had told herself was harmless at the time. She had met Lady Harcourt at a small card party hosted by a distant cousin, an event so unremarkable that Margaret had nearly declined the invitation altogether. Lady Harcourt had approached her directly, complimenting her gown, her wit, her clever observations about the other guests, and Margaret, starved for the kind of attention she had spent 3 seasons failing to secure from anyone of consequence, had allowed herself to be flattered into conversation that grew steadily more personal as the evening wore on. "It must be difficult," Lady Harcourt had said, her voice full of practiced sympathy, "watching your sister receive such unexpected fortune, when you yourself have worked so diligently for so little reward. I confess I have always believed the eldest and most accomplished daughters deserve the greatest consideration. yet the world rarely arranges itself so fairly, does it? Margaret had agreed, perhaps too readily, and the conversation had drifted from there into the particular pressures facing the Whitfield family, the debts her father struggled quietly to manage, the modest dowries that would accompany any of the sisters into marriage, the growing desperation beneath her mother's determined pursuit of advantageous matches. She had not meant to reveal so much. She told herself, even now, that she had simply been lonely, simply been flattered by a woman of consequence taking a genuine interest in her troubles for what felt like the first time in years. But sitting now in the quiet of her room, hearing the conviction in Julian's voice, as he defended Eleanor against accusations Margaret suspected, with growing certainty, had grown from seeds she herself had unknowingly planted, she understood at last how thoroughly she had been used. Lady Harcourt had wanted information, not friendship, and Margaret had handed it over freely, blinded by her own bitterness into believing herself clever rather than foolish. She thought of going to Eleanor immediately, of confessing everything and begging forgiveness before the damage grew any worse. But shame held her rooted to the spot, shame and a lingering, ugly thread of resentment that whispered Eleanor had brought this upon herself simply by existing in a way that overturned the natural order Margaret had always believed governed their family, the order in which beauty and charm were rewarded, and quiet plainness was overlooked. She hated herself for the thought even as it formed, hated the small, mean part of her heart that still, even now, could not fully separate love for her sister from resentment of her sister's unexpected fortune. In the drawing room below, Eleanor and Julian continued speaking long after the light outside had faded into evening, working through the practical steps they might take to protect her family from whatever Lady Harcourt intended next. Julian's solicitor would be consulted discreetly the following morning. Inquiries would be made, carefully and without drawing further attention, into the letter's likely origin. Julian insisted, gently but firmly, that Eleanor's family need not face any resulting expense, that he would see to whatever protection the situation required, regardless of what came of their courtship in the end. "You need not do this," Eleanor said softly, though gratitude filled her voice. "This is not your burden to carry, Julian. It became my burden the moment I crossed that ballroom to speak with you," he said. "I do not regret that choice, Eleanor, and I will not abandon its consequences now, simply because they have grown difficult. Whatever this letter is, whoever sent it, we will face it together, or not at all." Eleanor studied his face in the firelight, searching for any trace of doubt or hesitation, and found none. Whatever fear still coiled in her chest at the letter's cruel implications, she felt at ease, if only slightly, beneath the steady weight of his conviction. She did not yet know how much worse the coming weeks would grow, nor how close her family would come to public ruin before the truth finally emerged. But sitting there in the warm circle of firelight, her hand held firmly in his, she allowed herself to believe, however cautiously, that they might yet find their way through it together. Before he left that night, Julian paused at the door, turning back to face her with an expression more serious than any she had yet seen from him. "There is something else you should know," he said. "Whatever Lady Harcourt intends, she will not stop at a single anonymous letter. Women like her rarely surrender a campaign after only one attempt. I need you to be prepared for that, Eleanor, not frightened by it, but prepared." "I will be," she promised, though a small chill settled over her at the certainty in his voice. "Good." He pressed a brief kiss to her hand, lingering a moment longer than formality required. "Send for me the instant anything else arrives, no matter the hour. I mean that entirely." She watched him go from the drawing-room window, his carriage disappearing into the darkened street, and stood there a long while afterward, turning his warning over in her mind, wondering what shape Lady Harcourt's next attack might take, and praying, quietly, that her family possessed the strength to withstand it when it came. The scandal broke at the Ashford ball, exactly 9 days after the anonymous letter first arrived, and it broke with a viciousness that left Eleanor no room to defend herself before the damage had already spread through the entire room. She had not wanted to attend. Julian had been called away that very morning to one of his northern estates, a matter of urgent business involving flooding on his tenant lands that could not wait for a more convenient season. He had left reluctantly, pressing her hand and promising to return within the week, entirely unaware of what awaited her in his absence. "You must attend," her mother insisted, when Eleanor suggested she might plead illness instead. To stay away now would only fuel further suspicion. "We must show society that we have nothing to hide." Eleanor dressed that evening with a growing sense of dread she could not quite name, some instinct warning her that the calm of the past 9 days had been merely the stillness before a storm rather than its passing. She was not wrong. The whispers began the moment she entered the ballroom, quieter than before but somehow more dangerous for their restraint. Conversations that stopped abruptly as she passed, and resumed in lowered voices the instant she moved beyond hearing. She caught fragments here and there, enough to understand that something specific had begun circulating, something far more detailed than the vague accusations of the anonymous letter. Lady Harcourt found her within the hour, approaching with an expression of theatrical concern that fooled no one who understood her true nature. "Miss Whitfield," she said, loudly enough for those nearby to hear clearly, "I do hope you are bearing up well, given the circumstances. Such a difficult position to find oneself in." "I do not know what you mean, my lady," Eleanor said carefully, though her heart had begun to pound with dread. "Oh, come now." Lady Harcourt's smile sharpened at the edges. "Surely you have heard the details circulating this evening. I confess I found them shocking myself, though perhaps I should not have been so surprised. It does explain a great deal about your family's sudden good fortune." "What details?" Eleanor asked, though some part of her already feared the answer. Lady Harcourt leaned closer, her voice dropping to a register that somehow carried further than a whisper. "That your father arranged the entire courtship through a private financial agreement with the Duke's solicitor, offering forgiveness of certain debts in exchange for the Duke's public attention to you at that first ball. That the appearance of spontaneous romance was in fact entirely staged, orchestrated to spare your family public humiliation over its failing finances, while providing the Duke a convenient excuse to avoid more ambitious matches expected of him this season." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "That is entirely false. None of that happened. My father has never spoken with the Duke's solicitor about anything of the kind. I only repeat what others are saying, Miss Whitfield. I am certain the truth will emerge eventually, one way or another." Lady Harcourt's eyes glittered with satisfaction she made no real effort to hide. "Though I confess, given your family's circumstances, the story does seem rather plausible, does it not?" She swept away before Eleanor could formulate any further response, leaving her standing alone amid a room that had grown noticeably quieter, noticeably more attentive to her every movement. Eleanor searched desperately for her mother, for Charlotte, for anyone who might offer some anchor against the rising tide of humiliation closing in around her, but found only more whispers, more sidelong glances, more careful distance opening between herself and the crowd that had, only weeks before, watched her receive a Duke's unprecedented attention with something closer to grudging respect. The rest of the evening unfolded like a slow, deliberate unraveling. A young man she barely knew asked her directly, with false innocence, whether it was true her father had negotiated her courtship as one might negotiate a business contract. A group of women she passed near the refreshment table fell suddenly and pointedly silent, their eyes following her with open, unashamed curiosity. Even those who had previously shown her kindness now offered only careful, distant politeness, as though uncertain whether continued association might prove socially costly. By the time Eleanor's family finally departed, well before the ball's natural conclusion, she felt entirely hollowed out, as though every ounce of the fragile confidence she had built over the past weeks had been methodically stripped away in a single evening. "This is a disaster," Lady Whitfield said the moment their carriage pulled away from the Ashford house, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "An absolute disaster. How could this have happened?" "I do not know, Mother," Eleanor said quietly, staring out the carriage window at the darkened streets passing by. "I have done nothing to deserve this." "Deserving has very little to do with it," her mother snapped, though her anger seemed directed more at the situation itself than at Eleanor specifically. "We must consider how to manage the damage. Perhaps a public statement, or a letter to the most influential hostesses, denying the rumor before it spreads further." Charlotte said little throughout the ride home, her expression troubled in a way that suggested genuine sympathy for the first time since this entire affair had begun. Margaret, seated across from Eleanor, stared fixedly at her own gloved hands, saying nothing at all, though something in her stillness felt different from ordinary silence, something closer to guilt she could not quite bring herself to voice. The following days brought no relief. The rumor, once released, seemed to grow more elaborate with each retelling, gathering new details that made it sound increasingly credible despite containing no truth whatsoever. Invitations that had begun arriving regularly since Eleanor's connection to the Duke became known, now stopped entirely. Former acquaintances crossed streets to avoid conversation. Her father returned from his club one afternoon looking older than Eleanor had ever seen him, having overheard several gentlemen discussing the supposed financial arrangement with open amusement, as though her family's private struggles were nothing more than entertaining gossip to be traded over brandy and cards. Eleanor sent word to Julian the day after the ball, a careful letter explaining what had happened, though she found herself struggling to convey the full weight of the humiliation, without sounding as though she were begging for rescue. His response, when it finally arrived 4 days later, was shorter than she had hoped, explaining that the flooding at his northern estate had proven far worse than anticipated, requiring his continued presence for at least another week, though he promised to return as quickly as circumstances allowed, and asked her to remain patient in his absence. The letter, meant surely as reassurance, landed instead like another small wound. Eleanor understood, rationally, that his estate required urgent attention, that tenants facing flooded homes and ruined harvests could not simply wait for his convenience. But some smaller, more frightened part of her could not help wondering whether his absence at this precise moment, when she needed him most, suggested something less generous than duty, some quiet reconsideration taking shape beneath the polite formality of his letters. Perhaps, Charlotte ventured one evening, gently, as the sisters sat together in unusual quiet solidarity, he has heard the rumors himself, and does not know how to address them without causing further scandal for his own family. Perhaps, Eleanor agreed, though the word tasted bitter in her mouth. A full week passed with no further word from Julian beyond brief, formal notes that grew progressively shorter with each exchange. Meanwhile, the scandal in London showed no sign of fading. If anything, Lady Harcourt's careful cultivation of the rumor seemed to be bearing fruit precisely as she had intended, and Eleanor began to hear whispers of a new, even more damaging suggestion taking shape, that the Duke himself had begun to regret his impulsive attention toward her, that his prolonged absence signaled the quiet, dignified withdrawal of a man too proud to publicly admit his error. Eleanor did not believe this, not fully, not in the steady core of herself that remembered his voice promising he would not abandon her whatever came. But doubt, once planted, proves difficult to fully uproot. And by the second week of his absence, she found herself lying awake at night turning over every possible explanation, every fear, every quiet, treacherous thought that perhaps she had misjudged the depth of his regard after all. Her mother, meanwhile, grew increasingly desperate in her attempts to manage the family's collapsing social standing, until finally, on a particularly difficult afternoon, she summoned Eleanor to the drawing room, with an expression Eleanor had never seen her wear before, something closer to defeat than her usual brittle determination. "I think," Lady Whitfield said carefully, "that we must consider withdrawing from society entirely for the remainder of the season. Perhaps a visit to your aunt in the countryside, until this scandal has run its course and been replaced by some newer, more interesting gossip." "You wish me to hide," Eleanor said flatly. "I wish to protect what remains of this family's reputation," her mother said, though something in her voice suggested genuine pain beneath the practical concern. "Charlotte and Margaret still have prospects to consider, Eleanor. Every day this scandal continues, it damages their chances alongside your own." Eleanor understood the logic of it, even as it settled over her like a physical weight. She thought of retreating to the quiet countryside, of abandoning the fragile, hopeful thing that had begun growing between herself and Julian, of returning to the same overlooked obscurity she had occupied before that first ballroom encounter, except now carrying the additional burden of public scandal rather than simple plainness. "Give me until the end of the week," she said finally. "If Julian has not returned by then, if I have heard nothing further from him, I will agree to whatever you think best for the family." Her mother studied her for a long moment, something almost sympathetic crossing her tired features. "Very well," she said. "Until the end of the week." Eleanor spent the remaining days in a state of quiet, private anguish, torn between fierce loyalty to a man who had promised her steadiness, and growing fear that circumstances, or perhaps his own better judgment, had finally convinced him to abandon a courtship that had brought him nothing but scandal and difficulty. She walked in her garden each morning, seeking the comfort that had always lived among the roses, but found the flowers offered little solace against the growing weight of uncertainty pressing down upon her chest. On the 6th day, with no word yet from Julian and her mother's deadline looming, Eleanor sat alone in the small garden as evening approached, the last golden light of the day slipping slowly toward dusk, and allowed herself, finally, to weep. She wept for the humiliation of the Ashford ball, for the friends who had abandoned her at the first sign of scandal, for her family's mounting desperation, and most of all, for the small, hopeful thing she had allowed herself to believe possible, now seeming to crumble beneath the weight of circumstances entirely beyond her control. Sophia visited her that same afternoon, arriving unannounced with a concern that Eleanor found almost more difficult to bear than Lady Harcourt's open cruelty, for kindness, she was discovering, could wound just as deeply as malice when a heart had grown too tired to hold itself together. "I have written to my brother twice this week," Sophia admitted, settling beside Eleanor on the garden bench. I do not know why he has not answered more fully. It is unlike him to leave matters of importance so quiet, especially matters concerning you. Perhaps he no longer considers it a matter of importance, Eleanor said, hating the small, defeated note in her own voice, even as she spoke it. Do not say that. Sophia's tone sharpened, though not unkindly. You do not know my brother as well as you believe, if you think a scandal such as this would frighten him away. Julian has weathered far worse storms than idle gossip. Whatever keeps him at his estate, I promise you it is not indifference toward your suffering. Eleanor wanted desperately to believe her, and found that belief growing more difficult with each passing day of silence. She thought of the letter Julian had sent describing the flooding, the ruined harvests, the tenants displaced from their homes, and understood intellectually that such matters could not simply be abandoned for the sake of her comfort. But understanding and feeling proved two very different things, and her heart, worn thin by weeks of public humiliation, found little comfort in reasonable explanations. Lady Harcourt, meanwhile, seemed to sense victory drawing near, and pressed her advantage with renewed energy. A second wave of rumor began circulating through the city's finest drawing rooms, suggesting now that the Duke's continued absence proved beyond doubt that he had quietly abandoned the courtship, too proud to admit publicly what he had already decided privately. Invitations that might once have arrived for the Whitfield family ceased entirely. Shopkeepers who had once greeted Eleanor's mother with warm familiarity now offered only cool, distant courtesy. Even the servants seemed to whisper among themselves when they believed no family member was listening, and Eleanor caught fragments of pity in their glances that stung far worse than open scorn ever could. Her father, normally so quiet and removed from the household's daily dramas, took to walking the garden alone each evening, his expression heavy with worry he rarely voiced aloud. Eleanor found him there one night, standing among the roses she had tended so carefully, and joined him in silence for several long minutes before either of them spoke. I am sorry, he said finally, that I could not shield you from this. A father ought to be able to protect his daughters from cruelty such as this, and I find myself utterly powerless to do so. This is not your failing, father, Eleanor said gently. None of this is anyone's failing but Lady Harcourt's, and perhaps my own foolishness for believing something so fine could last without a fight. Do not call hope foolishness, he said, turning to look at her directly. Whatever comes of this, Eleanor, I have never been prouder of any of my daughters than I have been of you these past weeks, watching you bear such cruelty with more grace than most grown men could summon under similar pressure. His words offered small comfort against the mounting despair pressing down upon her, but she held them close nonetheless, turning them over in her mind long after he had retired for the evening. By the sixth night, with her mother's deadline arriving the following morning, and no word yet from Julian beyond his last brief formal note, Eleanor began, reluctantly, to prepare herself for the quiet retreat to the countryside her mother had proposed, for the slow, painful process of accepting that whatever had grown between herself and the Duke of Rothmere might simply prove too fragile to survive the world's determined cruelty. She packed her small trunk that evening with slow, careful hands, folding away the few fine gowns she had acquired since the courtship began, tucking her books and garden journals alongside them, with the quiet finality of someone closing a chapter she had not expected to end so soon. Charlotte helped her in silence, offering none of her usual commentary, and even that small mercy felt like its own kind of grief, a sister's unspoken acknowledgement that something precious was slipping away beyond either of their power to prevent it. Margaret came to her that night as well, hovering uncertainly in the doorway for a long moment, before finally stepping inside. Eleanor, she began, her voice unsteady in a way Eleanor had rarely heard from her. There is something I must tell you, something I should have told you weeks ago. But before she could continue, their mother called sharply from downstairs, summoning both sisters to help finalize arrangements for the morning journey, and Margaret's confession died unspoken on her lips, swallowed back beneath old habits of silence and self-protection. She left the room with the words still trapped inside her, promising herself she would find another moment, another chance, not yet understanding how little time remained before the truth would need to be told regardless of her courage or lack of it. Eleanor sat alone afterward on the edge of her half-packed bed, staring at the small, sad collection of belongings that represented everything she had allowed herself to hope for over these past extraordinary weeks. Tomorrow she would leave London, leave the scandal, leave whatever remained of a courtship that had once felt like the beginning of an entirely new life, and she did not know, lying awake long into the night listening to the quiet sounds of the sleeping house around her, whether she would ever find the courage to return. The carriage arrived just before dawn, its wheels loud against the quiet street, and Eleanor heard it from her window even before the household stirred to answer the urgent knocking at the front door. She descended the stairs, still in her dressing gown, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear she could not fully separate, and found Julian standing in the entrance hall, travel-worn and exhausted, his coat still dusted from the road, his expression carrying an urgency she had never before seen him display. "Eleanor." He crossed the hall toward her the moment he saw her, ignoring the startled butler and her mother's sharp intake of breath from the drawing-room doorway. "I received a letter 3 days ago from Sophia, describing everything that has happened here in my absence. I left within the hour. I have not stopped since, except to change horses." "You came back," she said, still uncertain she could trust the evidence of her own eyes after so many days of doubt. "Of course I came back." He took her hands in his grip firm despite the visible exhaustion in his face. "Eleanor, I am so deeply sorry. I should never have allowed my absence to stretch so long, whatever the demands of my estate. I should have trusted my instincts the moment Sophia's first letter arrived, rather than telling myself the matter could wait until the flooding was fully resolved. I have failed you these past 2 weeks, and I do not intend to fail you again." Lady Whitfield hurried forward from the drawing room, her earlier plans for a quiet countryside retreat visibly forgotten in the face of the Duke's dramatic arrival. "Your Grace, we did not expect. That is, we are honored, of course, but the hour is so early, and Eleanor's trunk is already—" "There will be no journey to the countryside," Julian said, his voice carrying the quiet authority Eleanor had rarely heard him use, though it silenced the room completely. "Not unless Eleanor herself wishes it, for reasons entirely her own. I did not travel through the night to find her preparing to flee a scandal she did nothing to deserve." Eleanor felt tears rise unexpectedly to her eyes, relief and exhaustion, and hope all tangling together until she could barely speak. "Julian, the things they are saying, the rumors about my father and your solicitor, are entirely false, and I intend to prove it publicly before this day is finished." He turned to address her mother directly. "Lady Whitfield, I must ask that you gather your family this morning. There is a matter I wish to resolve, and I believe it will require all of us working together to see it done properly." Within the hour, Julian's own solicitor arrived at the Whitfield house, along with a second gentleman Eleanor did not recognize, introduced simply as a colleague who had assisted in tracing the rumor's true origin during the days Julian had spent investigating from a distance even while managing the crisis at his estate. Together, they laid out for the assembled family what careful inquiry had uncovered. The anonymous letter, they explained, had been commissioned through an intermediary paid handsomely for discretion, a common enough practice among those in society wishing to spread damaging information without exposing themselves to direct consequence. That intermediary, once located and offered sufficient incentive to cooperate, had confirmed that the commission originated from Lady Vivian Harcourt, along with details of several similar campaigns she had orchestrated against other women in years past. Women who had, for reasons of their own, chosen never to challenge the rumors publicly. "I do not intend to make the same mistake those women made," Julian said, once the solicitors had finished their account. "I intend to expose this fully, publicly, and without any ambiguity remaining for society to misinterpret." Margaret, who had remained silent throughout the entire explanation, her face growing steadily paler with each detail revealed, finally spoke, her voice trembling. "There is something I must confess. I did not know what Lady Harcourt intended when I spoke with her. I swear to you I did not know. But I told her things about our family, about our finances, information she clearly used to make her lies sound more believable." The room fell silent. Eleanor turned to face her sister fully, searching her face for the truth behind the confession, and found only genuine, wretched shame. "I have wanted to tell you for days," Margaret continued, tears now falling freely down her cheeks. "I tried, last night, but I lost my courage. I am so sorry, Eleanor. I let my jealousy blind me to what I was truly doing, and I do not know how to ask your forgiveness for it." Eleanor felt a complicated tangle of emotions rise within her, hurt and anger warring against the evident, genuine remorse in her sister's voice. But she thought, too, of Julian's own words weeks before, of humiliation borne with dignity, of the value of honesty, even when it arrived too late to undo the damage already done. "You should have told me sooner," Eleanor said quietly. "But I understand, Margaret, better than you might think, how loneliness and envy can twist even a good heart into something it does not truly wish to be. I forgive you, though I will need time before I fully trust you again." Margaret nodded, unable to speak further through her tears, and Charlotte moved to comfort her, the three sisters bound together in this fragile, difficult moment by something more honest than they had shared in years. Julian, Watching this exchange with quiet respect for the family's private reconciliation allowed a moment to pass before speaking again. "This confession changes nothing about Lady Harcourt's culpability," he said. "She used information given in confidence to construct a deliberate campaign of cruelty, and I intend to see her held accountable for it before society this very evening." "How?" Eleanor asked. "There is a gathering tonight at Lord Ashford's house again, the same crowd that witnessed the worst of the rumors spread. I have already sent word that I intend to attend, along with you, if you are willing to stand beside me while I address this publicly." Eleanor hesitated only a moment before nodding. "I am willing." That evening, Eleanor dressed with a steadiness she had not felt in weeks, her mother fussing over the arrangement of her gown, while Charlotte and Margaret, still tentative but genuinely supportive now, helped arrange her hair with careful attention. She looked at herself in the mirror before departing and saw, for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone who did not shrink from her own reflection. The Ashford ballroom fell into familiar silence when Eleanor entered on Julian's arm, the same watchful, calculating silence that had once made her want to disappear entirely into the shadows near the windows. This time she did not retreat. She walked with Julian directly toward the center of the room, where Lady Harcourt stood near a cluster of the season's most influential hostesses, her expression flickering briefly with surprise before settling back into practiced composure. "Your Grace," Lady Harcourt said, offering a graceful curtsy. "How wonderful to see you return to town. I confess, we had all begun to wonder at your continued absence." "I imagine you had," Julian said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly attentive room. "Given that you were the one responsible for the rumors that made my absence appear so significant." A collective gasp moved through the nearby guests, conversations halting mid-sentence as heads turned toward the unfolding confrontation. Lady Harcourt's composure cracked, just slightly, before she recovered herself. "I have no notion what you mean, Your Grace. I have heard the same rumors as everyone else, but I assure you I have played no part in their creation." "I have proof to the contrary," Julian said, withdrawing a folded document from within his coat. "Signed testimony from the intermediary you employed to deliver an anonymous letter to the Whitfield household, along with detailed records of payment traced directly to your accounts. I have also gathered accounts from at least 3 other families you have targeted with similar campaigns over the past several years, women whose reputations you damaged for reasons no more substantial than wounded pride." The room had gone entirely silent now, every eye fixed upon the unfolding scene with the kind of rapt attention usually reserved for the theater. Lady Harcourt's face had gone pale beneath her careful cosmetics, her earlier composure entirely abandoned. "This is outrageous," she managed finally, though her voice lacked its usual commanding certainty. "You cannot simply—" "I can, and I have." Julian's voice remained steady, controlled, carrying none of the anger Eleanor knew he must be feeling beneath his careful composure. "Miss Whitfield's family has done nothing to deserve the cruelty you have inflicted upon them these past weeks. There was no financial arrangement, no scheme, no manipulation of any kind, beyond a genuine and growing affection between 2 people who found in each other something honest, which I understand must have proven difficult for you to witness, given your own ambitions in that direction." Lady Harcourt opened her mouth to respond, but found, evidently, that no adequate defense presented itself. She looked around the ballroom at the many faces now watching her with open, unconcealed judgment, faces that only weeks before had eagerly repeated every cruel rumor she had so carefully constructed, and understood, with visible dawning horror, that her own reputation now stood as thoroughly ruined as she had attempted to make Eleanor's. She left the ballroom shortly after, without another word, and Eleanor watched her go with a complicated mixture of relief and something almost like pity, understanding now, in ways she had not fully grasped before, how deeply wounded pride could curdle into genuine cruelty when left too long unchecked. Julian turned to Eleanor once Lady Harcourt had gone, and the ballroom, still watching with undisguised fascination, fell quiet once more as he took both her hands in his. "I have one more matter to address this evening," he said, his voice carrying clearly enough for the entire room to hear, though his eyes remained fixed only on her. "Eleanor Whitfield, I have known you now for scarcely 2 months, though it feels as though I have waited my entire life to find you. You have borne cruelty with more grace than I have seen from anyone in years of moving through this society, and you have done so without ever losing the honesty that first drew me to you, across a crowded ballroom not so very different from this one." Eleanor's breath caught, understanding suddenly what was unfolding before the entire watching crowd, before she had even fully prepared herself for it. "I do not offer you my hand out of pity, or obligation, or any desire to prove a point to society. Julian continued, lowering himself to one knee before her, ignoring the startled murmur that swept through the crowd at the gesture. I offer it because I have never in my life met anyone I trust so completely, or admire so deeply, and I find I have no wish to spend another day of my life without you beside me. Eleanor, will you marry me? For a moment, Eleanor could not speak at all, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of everything the past weeks had brought her, the humiliation and the hope, the cruelty and the unexpected kindness, all of it converging now into this single, extraordinary moment in a crowded ballroom that had once made her want to disappear entirely. Yes, she said finally, her voice clear and steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. Yes, Julian, I will marry you. The ballroom erupted into applause, genuine this time. The same crowd that had whispered such cruel things about her only days before now watching with open admiration, as Julian rose and pulled her into an embrace that cared nothing for propriety or watching eyes. Somewhere in the crowd, Eleanor caught sight of her mother weeping openly with joy, of Charlotte and Margaret embracing each other with matching expressions of relief and happiness, of her father beaming with a pride that seemed to erase, at least for this one perfect moment, all the worry of recent weeks. Later that evening, as the ball resumed around them and well-wishers approached in a steady stream to offer congratulations that felt entirely different from the cold curiosity of weeks past, Eleanor found a quiet moment alone with Julian, near the same windows where he had first approached her all those weeks ago. "Do you remember," she asked, "what you said to me that first night? That you asked for me because I did not laugh and I did not run." "I remember every word," he said, drawing her closer. "I think," she said softly, "that I have spent my entire life believing plainness meant being overlooked. And you have taught me it can mean something else entirely, if the right person is finally looking." Julian smiled, the same rare, genuine smile she had first glimpsed across his own quiet dinner table weeks before, and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "You were never plain to me, Eleanor. You were simply the only honest thing in a room full of performances, and I intend to spend the rest of my life grateful that I noticed." Sophia found them there a short while later, her own eyes bright with unshed tears as she embraced Eleanor warmly. "I told you," she said, laughing through her happiness. "I told you my brother had never looked at anyone the way he looks at you. I am only sorry it took such difficulty to bring you both to this moment." "Some things are worth difficulty," Eleanor said, glancing toward Julian with a warmth that needed no further words to explain itself. Lord Whitfield approached soon after, his usual quiet reserve entirely abandoned in favor of open, unguarded joy. He took his daughter's hands in his own weathered ones and studied her face for a long moment before speaking. "I told you once that careful was not the same as small," he said. "I do not think I have ever been more grateful to be proven right about anything in my life." "Thank you, Father," Eleanor said, "for never once doubting me, even when the rest of the world seemed determined to." Lady Whitfield, meanwhile, had already begun speaking excitedly with several of the evening's most influential hostesses, her earlier panic entirely forgotten in favor of triumphant plans for an engagement announcement that would surely be the talk of the season. Eleanor watched her mother's transformation with quiet amusement, understanding that some things about her family would likely never change, and finding, for the first time, that she did not mind so very much. Margaret approached last of all, hesitant even now, uncertain of her welcome despite the earlier reconciliation. "I am glad," she said simply, "truly glad, Eleanor. I know I have very little right to say so, after everything, but I am glad beyond words to see you happy." "Come here," Eleanor said, pulling her sister into a genuine embrace. "We have both learned difficult lessons this season, I think. Let us not carry the worst of them forward with us." Margaret nodded against her shoulder, and when she finally pulled back, something lighter had settled over her features, some old, familiar warmth between the sisters beginning, slowly, to rebuild itself from the wreckage of jealousy and misunderstanding. The following weeks passed in a happy blur of preparation, as news of the engagement spread through London with the same speed and enthusiasm that the earlier scandal had once carried, though this time the whispers that followed Eleanor through every drawing room held nothing but admiration. Invitations that had vanished during the worst of the rumor now arrived in greater numbers than ever before, though Eleanor found she cared rather less for such attention than she once might have, having learned through hard experience exactly how quickly society's favor could shift in either direction. She spent her mornings still in the garden whenever possible, tending the roses that had witnessed so much of her private joy and private grief over the preceding months, and it was there, on a bright morning some weeks later, that Julian found her once again, exactly as he had that very first afternoon after the ball. "You will always find me here," she said, smiling as he crossed the garden toward her, "whenever there is difficulty to escape or happiness to celebrate." "I am beginning to understand that about you," he said, settling onto the stone bench beside her rose beds. "I confess I have come to love this garden nearly as much as you do, though I suspect that has rather more to do with the company I keep here than the flowers themselves." Eleanor laughed, a bright, unguarded sound that would have seemed impossible to the quiet, overlooked young woman who had once stood pressed against a ballroom window, absorbing cruelty in silence because she believed she had no other choice. She thought sometimes, in quiet moments like this one, of that earlier version of herself, and felt not embarrassment, but a kind of gentle gratitude, understanding now that every difficult season of her life had led her, eventually, to exactly this moment, in this garden, beside this man who had seen something worth choosing in her long before the rest of the world had learned to see it too. Outside the tall windows of the house behind them, the city continued its restless daily rhythm, entirely unaware that within this quiet garden, a story that had begun with mockery and humiliation, had finally found its true and rightful ending, one written not in cruelty or gossip, but in the quiet, steady honesty of two people who had found, against every expectation, exactly what they had never dared to hope for. The wedding took place on a crisp autumn morning, 6 weeks after the engagement was announced, in a small stone chapel Julian's family had used for generations rather than the grand cathedral society had expected of a duke's marriage. "I want something quiet," he had told Eleanor, holding her hands across his study desk as they planned the details together. "Something that belongs to us, rather than to the crowd that spent weeks deciding what to believe about us." Eleanor had agreed readily, having had quite enough of crowded rooms and watching eyes to last a lifetime. The chapel held only close family and a handful of true friends, Sophia weeping openly throughout the ceremony despite her best efforts at composure, Lord Whitfield walking his daughter down the short aisle with a pride so evident it brought tears to more than one guest's eyes. Margaret and Charlotte stood together near the front, both dressed in matching gowns of soft blue, and Eleanor caught her sister Margaret's eye during the ceremony, exchanging a small, private smile that carried within it all the difficult, necessary healing of the preceding months. Their relationship had not returned to what it once was, not exactly, but something new and more honest had grown in its place, tempered by hard lessons neither sister would soon forget. The wedding breakfast that followed proved a warm, easy affair, full of genuine laughter rather than careful performance, and Eleanor found herself, more than once throughout the day, simply pausing to absorb the strange, wonderful reality of her new circumstances. She was a duchess now, a title that still felt unfamiliar on her tongue whenever someone addressed her by it, though Julian assured her, with the quiet humor she had come to treasure in him, that she would grow accustomed to it soon enough. They departed for a brief wedding journey to the coast shortly after, staying in a modest house Julian owned overlooking the water, far from the grandeur of his usual estates. Eleanor spent her mornings walking the shoreline collecting shells and pressed seagrasses for her garden journal, and her afternoons in quiet conversation with her new husband, learning still more of the private, careful man beneath the guarded Duke society had known for so many years. "I used to think," Julian admitted one evening, as they sat together watching the sun set over the water, "that I would spend the rest of my life alone. Not unhappily, precisely, but certainly without this." He gestured, somewhat helplessly, at the space between them. "I had convinced myself that trust of this kind belonged only to people who had never been betrayed by it. I am glad you proved me wrong." "I did very little proving," Eleanor said, leaning against his shoulder. "You did the harder work yourself, choosing to trust again despite every reason not to." "Perhaps we did the work together then," he said, and she found she could not argue with that. When they returned to London some weeks later, they found the city had largely moved on from the scandal that once consumed every drawing-room conversation, as society's attention, fickle as ever, had already turned toward newer gossip and fresher intrigue. Lady Harcourt had withdrawn from public life entirely following the confrontation at the Ashford ball, retreating to a distant country property where, by all accounts, she received very few visitors and extended very few invitations of her own. Eleanor felt, when she thought of her at all, not triumph but a distant, complicated pity, understanding now how loneliness and wounded pride could curdle a person's heart into something they perhaps never intended to become. Margaret, meanwhile, had begun a quiet correspondence with a gentleman she met through Sophia's wider circle of friends, a modest but kind country squire who seemed to value her honest conversation far more than the performance she had once believed necessary to secure any man's genuine interest. Eleanor watched her sister's careful, hopeful letters being written at the family's writing desk with quiet satisfaction, recognizing in Margaret's tentative happiness an echo of her own unlikely beginning. Charlotte, too, found her own season transformed by the family's restored standing, though she approached her prospects now with a thoughtfulness that had not always characterized her earlier seasons, having watched firsthand how quickly society's favor could turn, and how little that favor ultimately mattered compared to genuine affection honestly offered. Eleanor settled gradually into her new life as Duchess of Rothmere, dividing her time between the grand responsibilities of Julian's estates and the quiet pleasures that had always sustained her, her gardens chief among them. She oversaw the restoration of the neglected grounds at Rothmere House with the same careful attention she had once given her small plot behind her family's modest home, and within a year, visitors began remarking that the estate's gardens had become among the finest in the county, a transformation that brought her more genuine satisfaction than any of society's belated admiration ever could. Sophia remained a constant, treasured presence in her life, the sister of the heart Eleanor had never quite found among her own siblings until circumstances forced them all toward greater honesty. The two women spent countless afternoons together, discussing books and gardens and the small, ordinary joys of their intertwined lives, and Eleanor often reflected that she had gained not only a husband through that first unlikely ballroom encounter, but an entire family willing to see her clearly, plainness and all, and to value what they found there. Julian, for his part, found himself gradually drawn back into society, in ways he had avoided for years before their marriage, attending gatherings and hosting small dinners with a warmth that surprised even his oldest acquaintances. He credited the change entirely to Eleanor, though she insisted, whenever he made the claim, that he had simply rediscovered a part of himself long buried beneath grief and caution, one that had never truly disappeared, but had merely waited, patiently, for the right circumstances to draw it forward again. Nearly a year after their wedding, on another quiet evening in the garden that had witnessed so much of their courtship's difficulty and eventual triumph, Julian found Eleanor kneeling among a new bed of roses she had recently planted, her hands dark with soil, exactly as they had been the very first time he called upon her there. "I have news," he said, settling onto the familiar stone bench nearby. "Sophia tells me Lady Harcourt has finally left the country altogether, settling somewhere on the continent where her past, perhaps, will not follow quite so closely behind her. I hope she finds some measure of peace there," Eleanor said, and meant it sincerely, having long since released whatever bitterness she once carried toward the woman who had tried so hard to destroy her happiness. "Though I confess I think of her rarely these days. There is very little room left in my heart for old grievances, when it is already so full of everything I have gained instead." Julian watched her continue her careful work among the roses, the late afternoon light catching gently in her hair, and felt, not for the first time, an overwhelming gratitude for the strange, unlikely chance that had led him across a crowded ballroom to a quiet woman by the window who had refused, against every pressure surrounding her, to perform anything other than her true and honest self. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "what might have happened if I had simply left that ballroom without approaching you, as I nearly did that night?" Eleanor sat back on her heels, considering the question seriously, as she considered most things. "I think," she said finally, "that I would have continued exactly as I always had, overlooked and quietly unhappy, believing that was simply my place in the world. I am glad, more than I can properly express, that you chose differently." "So am I," he said, and reached down to help her rise, brushing the soil gently from her hands before drawing her close. "Every single day, so am I." Later that evening, after supper had been cleared and the household had settled into its quiet nighttime rhythms, Eleanor sat writing in her garden journal by the light of a single candle, recording the small details of the day the way she had done faithfully since childhood, the progress of the new roses, the particular color of the evening sky, the quiet contentment that had become so ordinary a part of her life that she sometimes had to remind herself how extraordinary its arrival had truly been. Julian found her there sometime later, still writing, and settled quietly into the chair across from her, rather than interrupting, content simply to watch her work with the same careful attention she brought to everything she loved. When she finally set down her pen, she looked up to find him smiling at her in the candlelight. "You are staring," she said, though without any real complaint in her voice. "I am allowed to stare at my own wife," he said, "particularly when she looks as content as you do just now." "I am content," she agreed. "More content than I ever imagined possible in those difficult early days when everything felt so uncertain." "Do you think of those days often?" he asked, curious rather than concerned. Eleanor considered the question honestly, as she always did. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Not with sadness any longer, but with a kind of gratitude, strange as that may sound." I think if I had never known what it felt like to be overlooked and mocked, I might not appreciate quite so fully what it means to be truly seen. Difficulty taught me something valuable, in the end, even if I would not wish to relive it. Julian reached across the small table between them and took her hand, turning it gently in his own, tracing the small calluses that gardening had left on her palm over the years, marks she had once been faintly embarrassed by and now wore without any self-consciousness at all. I think, he said, that whatever difficulty brought us to this moment, I am simply grateful it did. I do not know that I believe everything happens for some grand, necessary reason, but I do believe that some difficulties, faced honestly and together, leave us stronger than we were before facing them. That sounds like something out of one of your sister's favorite novels, Eleanor teased gently. Perhaps it does, he admitted, laughing. I suppose I have grown rather sentimental since marrying a woman who spends her mornings talking to roses. They listen far better than most people do, Eleanor said, smiling. They sat together a while longer in the quiet candlelight, speaking of small, ordinary things, the kind of easy conversation that had once felt impossible to Eleanor in her earlier, more guarded years, when every word spoken to a man of consequence had felt like a careful performance she might fail at any moment. There was no performance now, only the comfortable honesty of two people who had chosen each other freely, and who intended, each and every day that followed, to keep choosing each other again. Outside the window, the garden rested quietly beneath the gathering night, the roses folded closed until morning light would call them open again, patient and certain in their season, exactly as Eleanor herself had learned, at last, to be. The girl once called the plainest of her sisters had become, in the end, not simply a duchess, but something far rarer still, a woman fully and finally seen for exactly who she had always been, and who had, in turn, learned to see herself just as clearly.